My name is Matt Rojansky. I'm the director of the Kennan Institute. Ed has asked me to moderate this second panel, and I think rather than abusing the moderator's prerogative and talking at you, I am going to go right to our extremely distinguished and thoughtful panel. Obviously, we're following a discussion that's already probably opened and asked a great many questions that need to be answered. Some of the answers are out there already. But I think that the most important of those questions is the so-called Lenin question, что делать? What the heck do we do now? And I hope that this panel, and I certainly know that this panel is qualified to offer some insightful contributions in that direction. We're going to stick more or less with the order on the program. What we are going to do, though, is keep it short, make sure we can get to some questions, and then try to wrap the whole thing up by around 5. So, without further delay, let me give the floor to Ambassador Jack Matlock.
Well, thanks very much. You know, I was asked to come and prepare something for somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes, and now I'm told I have 10. But we've had such I think, a rich discussion so far this morning. I will try not to spend too much time repeating the sort of things that were said earlier. Most of them most important. In particular on the geopolitical side of things, I would like to particularly endorse Bob Legball's rundown. I think he's given us a very important rundown on some of the implications of the current confrontation. There is one overall assessment that I still don't share with at least some of the previous speakers, and that is, are we in a new Cold War? I don't think so, and I think that calling the current polemics, which do sound like those during the Cold War, a new Cold War, is almost a travesty as one who went through the Cold War. And I think this is particularly true from the standpoint of the United States. During the Cold War, we were in an arms race with each side, at times, as much as 40, 50,000 nuclear weapons. We were in polemics on almost every area of the world, and our weapons were on trigger alert, and there were plans on both sides, conditions under which you would strike the other. You know, I think we still talk about how the kids were taught if there was a nuclear attack to hide under their desk and so on. This is out now. I don't live in Washington anymore. I haven't for some time. I've been at Princeton on the East Coast and at my wife's farm in Tennessee. I'll tell you, outside the Beltway here and some of the media, particularly on the East Coast, we are not in a Cold War. Nobody is paying any much attention. Most Americans don't even know where Ukraine is. Yes, the implications to both countries from the present confrontation are serious, and yet the biggest problems out there are problems that have nothing to do with this, and the problems we're being impeded, both governments, from dealing with them. Just looking at the news the last couple of days about the jihadists that now have a base in a good part of Iraq and apparently part of Syria, something that is certainly something that is a threat both to Russia and the United States, and for that matter to Iran. You know, and the idea that somehow these alliances are frozen and our interest, that if one, you know, acts against the interests of the other, that it's not going to affect the person acting. I mean, this is just not the world we're living in. Okay. Now, what do we do about it? I don't think we can think through what we do about it without at least understanding how we got here. What did we do wrong? And let me say, I think both sides did things wrong. I'm not one who will say, for example, that because the United States made mistakes in some of its policies, I think it did, that Russia's reaction was appropriate or even in Russia's interest. I think what we have seen over a period of years, beginning roughly in the late 90s when we began expanding NATO under the terms that we did, that we had what I would have said is inconsiderate American actions met by Russian overreaction. Many of the things that we see Russian reactions, their reaction not so much to reality, but to a distortion of what was perceived. Now, we have gone through, our speakers before, a number of those. I don't have time to recite them now. But I would say that as we look at the whole Ukraine issue today, which has precipitated what some have called a new Cold War, and have precipitated what I think are not at all helpful sanctions, because these sanctions cut off contacts when we should be expanding them rather than cutting them off when there are differences. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that we not only need to understand what was done wrong in the past, but take a few looks at what we did right. How did we bring the Cold War to an end? There's a lot of detail out there, but there were just a few issues that I think were important. First of all, this was never a left-right issue, an issue between liberals and conservatives. It's just a totally irrelevant consideration. I'm a pragmatist, and I believe in looking at results. And I think you have to look at results that favor the interests of both sides. So how did we start out getting off the zero-sum sort of competition we had during the Cold War? I came into the Reagan administration right at the height of our polemics. And the first thing we did was to begin to define our goals in terms of cooperation, not in terms of something one side had to do or the other. And whether it was reducing arms or withdrawing from conflict in third areas, protecting human rights, or bringing down the Iron Curtain, which we said delicately, develop a better working relationship, we couched it in terms, let's cooperate to do this, an end that clearly both we wanted. Second, in their very first summit meeting, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won, and that means there can be no war between us. We took war and any military action against the other off the table before we even talked about anything else. Then George Shultz would go to Moscow and would point out how the countries that were making the greatest economic progress then, countries like Japan, Germany, others, usually spent less than 1% of their GNP on military, and said, what are we doing? We're robbing our people to arm for a war we're never going to have. That is just stupid. And it was. But then our people could understand it. Also, one of the first things Ronald Reagan wrote, and this was not a staff-written thing, before he first met Gorbachev, he said, we are much too upfront regarding human rights. We can hammer at them, and we'll get cheers from the bleachers, but it won't help the people infected. In fact, it can hurt them. We need to go private. And the rhetoric, public rhetoric and demands regarding human rights virtually ended. Certainly at the presidential level, it was put on a private tack. He and our first President Bush also understood that there are things that are so delicate you handle in private. When the television tower was attacked in Vilnius, well, of course, President Bush had to condemn what had happened, But he didn't rail at Gorbachev. He didn't make public demands on Gorbachev. He sent him a letter, which I delivered privately by myself, and simply said, look, we're going to have to terminate a lot of our cooperation that is developing if the violence doesn't stop in the Baltic states. Meanwhile, we were telling the leaders of the Baltic countries, we sympathize with your desire for independence. We don't recognize you as part of the Soviet Union. But number one, we can't recognize you as independent officially until you are. And number two, if you are repressed, we cannot help you. Keep it peaceful. Don't respond to provocations. Because if you're crushed, you're going to be crushed. Now, you know, I think now, jumping ahead, and I'm really going to almost complete with this, it seems to me that when we started expanding NATO, one of the points that many of us made was we needed a different structure providing assurance to Eastern Europe. That was important. But simply to expand the existing Cold War institution, which was going to change, but still it had been a Cold War institution, without including Russia at that time. I'm speaking the late 90s. At some point, I said, you're going to have to stop, and that's going to be hard to do, because it's inconceivable that any Russian leader would ever permit places like Ukraine or Georgia, those parts which had been recognized as part of the Soviet Union, had become independent, not because of any demand from the West or outside, but because of internal pressures. Borders set during the Soviet period, not by the West, not by the international community, not by the people there. And yes, it is important to establish that borders are sacrosanct, and we had agreed at Helsinki in 1975 that they wouldn't be changed without mutual agreement. Well, you know, one side or the other began to forget about one or the other of these things as time went on. But the question is, of course, that the course of events, and particularly leading to the present situation in Ukraine, I think has been a course of often what was American and Western inconsiderateness and overreaction by Russia. And this has brought on a very, very emotional confrontation, which has profound implications. I don't think it's going to lead to a new Cold War on any long scale, but many of the things that are happening are damaging, and particularly damaging to Russia. Not the sanctions. What I have against the sanctions is, of course, they're not going to change anything substantial. They are going to change attitudes, and it's going to give the Russian government an excuse when it has to pay the price for many of the things that are happening now. Blame them on the West and on sanctions. Just as many people now apparently seem to think that the West brought down the Soviet Union. We didn't. We tried in 1991 to help Gorbachev keep it together. Bush, the first Bush, advised the Ukrainians to agree to the Union Treaty. We didn't want the Soviet Union to break up. Now, how suddenly the territorial integrity of Ukraine or its independence becomes a vital national interest of the United States is sort of beyond me. I can understand that certainly recognized borders need to be respected. That's important. But there are many other issues here. And if we have a sense of history, and we don't have to go back centuries, though sometimes that helps too. But the thing is that what we have is a situation in which the recent moves by Russia are going to be very costly to it. The world is moving on, and the United States is having trouble keeping up with technology, with our own infrastructure and whatnot. I don't think the big issue now are these geopolitical games that are played, particularly when you play the geopolitical games that you destroy, in effect, the very object that you seem to be struggling about. This is not what is going to make history in the future. And for a Russian Federation with more than 20% of its population non-Russian to base its policies ostensibly on protecting Russians and Russians alone, or to condemn another government which moves militarily against rebels when it has a record of moving against the Chechens in even more destructive fashion, does seem really a bit strange. But my own feeling is the United States should step back, should, in the case of Ukraine, do our best to cooperate with Russia, with the EU, with all the factions in Ukraine to try to get a situation in which Ukraine will have a chance to heal its internal differences, to move toward a more modern economy, to deal with the corruption, which is even worse there than in Russia. And this can, in the long run, help Russia. Because let's face it, an isolated Russia, which is a mere appendage of China, shouldn't be the future that Russia wants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Matlock. Next, we have Leonid Gozman. I think we can feel certain that this is a panel which is not intimidated to point out where the United States has erred, but also where the Russian Federation has erred in the last several months of this crisis. Leonid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I would like to say thank you to Ed Lazansky. Ed, where are you? No. Ah, here. Okay, look, why? Because we know each other for many years, and I never agreed with him. Never. Never. When we discussed something, I said, no, you are wrong, you understand nothing, and so on. Anyway, he invited me here. So I'm very grateful. I think it's behavior of dignity. So I'm very glad. I'm really very glad to be here. And I must introduce myself, not because it's so important, but because it's important for the listeners to understand who is saying to trust or not, to believe in his words or not to believe in his words. So I am Russian. I live in Moscow. You know this, all these prominent speakers are well known for you. It's, I cannot say it about myself, of course. So I'm Russian. I live in Russia. And 90% of Russians, 90% of Russians support the annexation of Crimea. 90% says definitely yes and yes. And only 1% says no, definitely no. I'm one of this 1%. I say definitely no. I think that annexation of Crimea, it's more than a crime, as Talleyrand said. It's a mistake. And it's a terrible mistake. It's a crucial mistake. I think that the president of my country made the crime, it's not the word in politics. I think he made the serious mistake which will be crucial for my country, unfortunately. And these ideas are very popular in some circles in Russia and in America as well, that it was just an answer, deliberate reply for some of your actions of the last 20 years. Of course, you made a lot of mistakes, certainly. But it's the same like, this famous dialogue when the judge asks, why did you rob the bank? And the answer, Your Honor, I was hungry. So it's the same. We had no reasons for such actions, in my mind. So it's just introduction of myself, Ed asked me to discuss your actions, your politics in this crisis. I have no right to say what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad for the United States of America. I like your country and I respect your state, and I'm sure that your president, your Congress, your experts can resolve all these problems without my assistance. Mr. Obama didn't ask my advice yet. When he asked, of course, I'll be happy. But what I can say, what I have a right to say, it's how your politic recognized in Russia. How do Russians see your politic, and how your politic influence the situation in Russia? First, about the perception. The perception may be absolutely wrong, but you understand, perception is reality. We react not to the real world, we react to our image of the world. So, what's the perception of your politic? It's not very positive. It's not very positive. You know, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because I'm among those, this minority of Russian citizens who think that the strategic union, not just cooperation, strategic union between Russia and the United States of America, it's very important for both countries and for the world. I had an honor, and I have an honor to be a member of the party, which wrote in its program that our goal is a full membership in NATO. Russia's full membership in NATO. Maybe it takes a lot of time, but we want to be in NATO. We think that it's absolutely natural for Russia because we are a European country, and it's not only my idea. The great Empress Ekaterina II wrote it, that Russia is a European country, and I agree with her. So I think that it's very negative that your politics perceives rather negatively. Well, it looks as weak, it looks like contradictory inside itself, and we do not understand it, unfortunately. When I say we, I do not mean those people in Russia, 90% or maybe 95%, who knows exactly that United States of America are the source of all our problems. All our problems. That it's a world conspiracy against Mother Russia, and you lead this conspiracy, and Tartar invasion, and you organized Tartar invasion in 13th century. Okay, forget about these people. Forget about these people. You cannot persuade them. I'm talking about Russian government as I feel it, and I'm talking about Russian intellectuals. We do not understand you. We do not understand. What do you really want? We do not understand how far you can go, how far you are ready to go. You don't understand how will you react to this or that situation. I think it's very bad. Okay, I don't understand it, forget about me. But if Mr. Putin doesn't understand you, it's very bad. It's very bad because you want to influence him. If you want to influence him, you must give him the clear picture. The clear picture. He must understand the consequences of his actions. I'm not sure that he understands it. Now, and. So your logic, sometimes it's a great secret for us. For example, your sanction lists. One problem is that you couldn't achieve the same sanction list with Europe. And it's your weakness, of course, and it gives Mr. Putin a room for maneuvers. And he is genius in such maneuvers, genius. So, okay, well, you cannot do it, I understand. But your sanction list, if it's against Putin's friends, to influence Putin, to make his life not so good, okay, it's okay, it's okay. If so, why in this list are some people who are not Putin's friends? If it's a list of those who are responsible for annexation of Crimea, which, as I said, I think terrible thing, which destroyed international relationships and so on, I think that in history, Putin was never forgiven for this. But, okay, if it's a list of those who are responsible for Crimea, so why they are his friends who had no deal with Crimea? So let's make a choice. Putin friends, okay. Okay, it's very reasonable. It's very reasonable. But you know, your opponents, and Putin is your opponent now, must understand you. Maybe it's better if he has wrong understanding, okay? But he must have a picture. He has no picture now, unfortunately. And I think it's not a problem of your politics, maybe it's a problem of explanation of your politics. Okay, it's number one. Number two, do you influence Russia for your sanctions or not? My answer, yes, you influence Russia. Sanctions are very painful. Our officials laugh on TV that it's nothing and so on. Okay, they must do it. They must do it. Don't believe in them. Don't believe in them. I know that many people in America say that Obama is so weak and these sanctions means nothing and so on. I don't know is Obama weak or strong. It's your domain. It's not my domain. But I know that sanctions are crucial for Russia. Why? For two reasons. There are two levels of sanctions, two directions of the sanctions. Sanctions against his friends, his personal friends, makes the atmosphere in the top of Russian elite terrible. Okay, let's say that you are Vladimir Yakunin, who is a chairman of Russian railway roads, a close friend to Putin, Russian Orthodox and KGB guy at the same time, and so on and so on. Very nice guy. Okay, not very poor guy. Not very poor guy, believe me. I think, I don't know how many billions, but don't worry about him and about his great children. Well, I think he can buy the Washington itself, just all the city. Well, you are Yakunin. Or anybody else. Yakunin just a well-known name. Okay, anybody else? Mr. I don't know who, Petrov. Well, Mr. Petrov, your wife is in the West. Your girlfriends are in the West. Boyfriends of your girlfriends are in the West. Your kids study in American or British universities. You have the castle in Spain, the castle in France, something in Florida, and so on and so on and so on. And the main thing, you have a plan, you have a dream. Your dream to live here and to die here. To go to the West after retirement and never return back to Russia. It's their common attitude. Now, okay, you are Mr. Petrov, you have all this, you have aircraft ready to fly, but you cannot fly. You will stay here. So, when you meet your mutual friend, Mr. Putin, what will you say him? Say, do you understand what are you doing? Why should I be here? Why? It's not something we talked about. We talked about freedom for us, for our team, of course, for our team. Well, maybe those who organized, those who created these sanction lists, maybe they dreamed about palace coup. Maybe, I don't know. I must disappoint them. It will be no palace coup. Because Mr. Putin is 10 times smarter than all his team together. 10 times smarter. So it will not be the coup. But the atmosphere is very tensive. So it's efficient, it's effective. Then in economy, in real economy, the results of your sanctions and your position for real economy, terrible, crucial. Why? We have no so-called long money in Russia. Or we don't have enough long money in Russia. But if you want to build, for example, the power station, you need $1, $2, $3 billion for 20 years. At least for 20 years. Where can you find them? American banks just began to say no. They do not want to make a deal with us. They're afraid. For 1 year, okay, certainly. For 2 years, welcome. For half a year, great, but not for 20 years. And the same about your investments. If you have $500 million and you are thinking where to send this money, several months ago you had a plan to go to Russia with this money. Now you will go to Thailand or to Africa, I don't know where, but not to Russia. And this is terrible. And 90% of our population said yes for Crimea. But if you talk with Russian elite, it's frustrated. I do not know any one businessman, any one politician, any one military general who would be happy now. Russian elite understands how much shall we pay for this strange operation with Crimea. So we feel your sanctions. We feel them very, very seriously. But will they lead to our steps back, or will they lead to our steps forward? Maybe you'll be surprised, I don't know. I don't know. If Putin doesn't understand you, if Putin doesn't feel you, he will go forward. Of course, it depends on President Poroshenko. If President Poroshenko win military game in the southeast, so situation will be much better, much better. But if not, it's very important for all of us that we understand you. And I begin with that I cannot give you advices. Sorry, I have one advice. I have one advice to President Obama, who meet him this evening. Tell him, please. I think that, you know, it's a strange situation. You have no ambassador. You have no ambassador. In such crisis, it's a terrible crisis in our history. Maybe most deep crisis in our history. I don't know, ambassador knows better, of course. And you have no ambassador. I think it's absolutely necessary to have diplomacy out of the scene, absolutely confidential. And if there is a guy here who can be sent to President Putin on behalf of President Obama, absolutely confidential, absolutely classified, with a personal letter, because telephone conversations, it's not enough. Telephone conversations cannot be secret. So many people hear it. So 2 hours after conversations, you can read all this in internet, or sometimes an hour before. But we really need normal communications. Normal communication. Again, I think that my country made a terrible thing, just terrible thing, and it's a shame for us that it's our country made it. But anyway, we still alive. We all are still alive. So let's talk to each other, and please be understandable for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, then. And so, anybody volunteer to draft that letter from? It would be a challenging task, but one perhaps that Wayne Mary would be up to. Wayne.
Thank you, Matthew. Before I tell you what I think we should be doing, we the West, we the United States with Russia, I think I want to define what the nature of the problem we're dealing with. This is not a return of the Soviet Union. That's nonsense. I lived in the Soviet Union. Russia today doesn't look anything like it. This is not fascism. That's a word that has lost all meaning and content. It's just a mutual insult that everybody uses toward everybody else. I think we are, however, looking at a Russia which is reflective of a form of what I would call reactionary nationalism, a Russian state that is turning inward on itself, not just turning away from the West, not just from the European world, but from the Asian East, from the Islamic South, that is seeking to build a kind of a Eurasian redoubt and to find in the middle of that a strength in Russian history, Russian orthodoxy, and Russian culture. I think turning away from the world, away from globalization and modernization to a form of self-imposed autarky is what we're looking at in Russia. And it is a huge challenge for the outside world in terms of devising a coherent policy. We see that most obviously today in the problems of Ukraine. And I want to emphasize my view that the Ukraine crisis has two authors. The first of them was in Brussels. Anyone who knows anything about Ukraine knows that the state that emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union is not only the widest country in Europe geographically, but in political culture, and that it encompasses very strong regional identities, and that any successful Ukrainian government has to reflect that eastward and westward duality. It's a Janus-like country, not only in its foreign policy, but in its internal character. And the absolutely existential requirement for any successful Ukraine policy, whether it be a government in Kiev or an external government, is to respect this internal balance of East and West in that country. Unfortunately, the European Commission chose not to. The association agreement that was presented to Ukraine is not benign or neutral. It's as presented. It's over 1,000 pages long, and it would export over 2/3 of the acquis communautaire to Ukraine. And the acquis is the fundamental mechanism of the European Union for the sharing of sovereignty. The association agreement would require, if implemented, which is a major if clause, but would require for Ukraine fundamentally to choose one vector, not only in its foreign and economic policy, but in its national identity. I have no doubt that many people in Western Ukraine would welcome that. But the problem is that it forces people in Eastern Ukraine to reject it. It also presents a huge challenge to the national interests of the Russian Federation because of the deep economic integration that Eastern Ukraine and Russia have. I think the unfortunate failure of major European governments, particularly the Germans and the French, to exercise adult supervision over the European Commission in the formulation of the association agreement presented at the Vilnius Summit is one of the greatest failures of Western policy since the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, the Russian reaction was even worse. I have no doubt that Russia has many sources of influence, power, and assets in Ukraine, and it could have responded to this challenge without using the means that it did, which were excessive, crude, and self-defeating, and have created that which is not only unnecessary, but is, one would think, is the last thing that Russia would want, which is a permanently Russophobic Ukrainian state. Because since the Ukrainian constitution defines Crimea as part of Ukraine, it means that Poroshenko and any other Ukrainian official for the indefinite future must conduct a policy which is at heart adversarial toward Russia. How this is in the interest of Russia is beyond my ability to comprehend. I sincerely hope that people in Moscow understand that the fundamental prerequisite for keeping Ukraine out of NATO is to keep the Donbass in Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, this tragedy has led to what to me is an even more worrisome set of policies coming out of Moscow, which is their rationalization on ethno-confessional terms. If these policies, whether on Crimea or in eastern Ukraine, had been justified only in strategic, political, economic terms, would have been bad enough, but at least arguable. But a Russian government which defines Russian policies, Russian interests, and even Russian identity in ethno-confessional terms is something the world has not seen in over 100 years. This is not a return to Soviet policies at all. No Soviet regime would have used this terminology at all. This is a very disturbing development, not just in terms of Russia's relations with its neighbors, but even more so in terms of Russia's own internal future. Because in the same way that the regional balance is the existential requirement for peace in Ukraine, the existential requirement for the peaceful development of Russia is the maintenance of its multi-ethnic and multicultural and multi-confessional diversity. Anything which changes that is opening a door to a very, very uncertain future. Now, what should the West, including the United States, do about these issues? In the case of Ukraine, I would argue that this is fundamentally a problem for the European state system and is a dispute between the major Western European countries and Russia, with obviously Kiev involved. And that what the model that is needed is not that of Finland, but that of perhaps Austria in the state treaty or Belgium in the independence treaty in the 19th century. Both of these are very successful examples of countries that were made independent, secure, and neutral by international agreement, and that worked very successfully. To those who would argue that many people in Ukraine would not wish that kind of neutrality, I would point out that most people in what became Belgium didn't want it in the 1830s either. Many of the Wallonians wanted union with France. Many of the Flamands wanted union with Holland. But the European powers decided that the peace of the continent required the establishment of a separate, independent, and permanently neutral Belgium, an arrangement which worked very well until the entire European state system itself collapsed with the beginning of the First World War. The Austrian state treaty is a very successful example of how East and West could come together to guarantee the unity and the neutrality of a European state in the very heart of the continent. I understand Ukraine is much larger and more complex. It doesn't mean, however, that the principles are not equally applicable. Now, in terms of dealing with the nature of this increasingly autarkic and inward-looking Russian state that I have described, my recommendation for what the United States should do is nothing. Leave it alone. Let the Russians work it out themselves. It will not be quick. It will not be easy. It will not be pretty. It will be a huge and difficult, challenging period for Russians. But the American record of managing the affairs of other countries, whether Russia or Iraq or Afghanistan, is hardly one that recommends a continuation of that approach. Whether the neoliberal approach of the 1990s or the neoconservative approach that followed it, or the rather unholy conflation of the two which exists today. I remember from my own graduate student days at Princeton meeting Ambassador George Kennan at a time when he was already looking forward past the Soviet Union, looking to a Russian state that would emerge from the end of the Soviet Union. And his recommendations, in person and in writing then, were to leave it alone. Give them time. Don't try to tell them what to do. Let them work out their own future in their own way. I was inspired by what I remembered from my student days meeting with Ambassador Kennan 20 years ago this spring, the spring of 1994, at the embassy in Moscow to write a very long message in the State Department's dissent channel, in which I advised Washington that the application of the neoliberal macroeconomic stabilization program being pushed by the U.S. Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, and various American economic experts not only would fail in Russia, because it had to fail, but would convert Russia into an adversary of the United States, rather than as a potential partner on the global stage. I think the intervening 20 years demonstrates that the analysis of the counterproductive character of American efforts to try to teach the Russians how to run their own society indicates that even in the very negative, very grim, very unpleasant circumstances that are developing in Russia today, almost entirely self-imposed, that the best thing the United States can do is to try to work toward a reasonable relationship between the two states, government to government, on issues that are of importance to us, either bilaterally or multilaterally, of which there are a great many, but otherwise Leave Russia alone.
Thanks very much, Wayne. As a parent of young children, I am reminded by your comments of the exhaustion one feels at investing very well-meaning energy and attention for a sustained period of time and getting absolutely no result, and tempted to apply your framework to my own life, except I think if I leave well enough alone, I may find myself left alone by others in my life. Though I think your advice probably applies better in diplomacy. Speaking of the difficulty of formulating policy in the world of diplomacy, I think that James Cardin was more recently than anyone else on this panel in the U.S. government working on exactly these difficult policy problems. So James, take us down the home stretch.
Okay, thank you, Matt. As you mentioned, I was recently an advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Commission, which during my time there happened to coincide with what I'm going to describe today as the post-reset unraveling in relations between the United States and Russia. But I think it's important when talking about the reset policy and the bilateral commission which was created to help carry it out that we neither want to overestimate the extent of policy failure, nor should we underestimate its achievements. Though perhaps its signal achievement was to manage something that I think very rarely happens in Washington these days. It united both Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives in a shared contempt for a policy they believed naive, foolish, and dangerous to U.S. interests abroad. The neoconservative publicist Jennifer Rubin summarized the prevailing view thusly: "We've gotten nothing and given up much in the last 4 years and given Vladimir Putin a pass on his internal repression." Yet the fact of the matter is that the reset policy in large part achieved what it set out to do. It managed, albeit temporarily, to lower the temperature, and it does have its share of tangible achievements to its name. We could start with New START, the 123 Plutonium Accord on nuclear cooperation, a revised and strengthened visa agreement, and an innovative agreement that encourages cooperation and economic ties between American states, Russian oblasts, and Russian and American cities. Yet, a problem with the reset was that it was overly concerned with producing, and forgive me for lapsing into bureaucratese here, it was overly concerned with producing deliverables. And the production of ever more deliverables seemed to become an end unto itself, and addressing the cause of the underlying friction in the relationship seemed to be set aside. The second problem with the reset has to do with Congress. At the very time Mr. Putin was signaling a return to the presidency, the U.S. Congress, never quite able to leave well enough alone, passed the Magnitsky Act. This act was passed at the urging of a British hedge fund manager named Bill Browder. Mr. Browder, who renounced his American citizenship in 1997, has made many powerful friends up on Capitol Hill. An early supporter of Mr. Putin, Browder has turned against him, blaming him for the death in pretrial detention of one of his accountants, the aforementioned Magnitsky. Congress was by no means alone in its effort to influence Russia's internal political development. Take, for example, the comments by then State Department spokesman Victoria Nuland. At a press conference at which she was questioned over the expulsion of USAID in Russia in September of 2012, Russian noted that while our physical presence in Russia is going to end, we remain committed to supporting democracy, human rights, and the development of a more robust civil society in Russia. And we look forward to continuing our close cooperation with Russian non-governmental organizations. She then noted that over the last 20 years, USAID had spent nearly $3 billion on programming in Russia, a third of which had gone towards democracy promotion. Think about that. Does anyone here know what the unemployment rates in District Wards 5, 7, and 8 are? Nope. In Ward 5, 9.5%. In Ward 7, nearly 12%. And in Ward 8, nearly 18%. Yet we spent $1 billion trying to export our system of democracy 5,000 miles from our shores. So I've spent some time now talking about where things went wrong. What might a renewed push to improve U.S.-Russian relations look like now? I think a good place to start would be a reiteration of the 1997 pledge by NATO not to deploy substantial combat forces in the territory of new NATO member states. Yet I expect that that's the very last thing NATO planners would do when they meet in Wales this coming September. I think a post-reset policy ought to be one which emphasizes normalization, and that, at the very minimum, would require two things. The first would be a recognition that a mature great power to great power relationship means that Russia should no longer be on the receiving end of either America's tutelage or its largesse. The Russian government has made it abundantly clear over the past 2 years that it no longer wishes to be a recipient of U.S. foreign aid. And given the troubling economic situation in the U.S., I think the Obama administration should be happy to oblige. The second requirement would be a recognition that the U.S. and Russia have fundamentally divergent approaches towards their respective geopolitical challenges, yet several of these challenges are in their mutual interest to address. Leading the list is the ongoing effort to secure Syria's stockpile of chemical weapons, followed closely by combating terrorism and promoting nuclear nonproliferation. Over the medium to longer term, the U.S. and Russia will need to come to terms over the aforementioned Northern Distribution Network, containing a revanchist North Korea, and working towards a sensible and workable replacement for the Nunn-Lugar program. Yet a limited reset would do little to change the dangerous boom-bust dynamic of the U.S.-Russian relationship. And for that to change, we would need to form a new national consensus, radically revising the aims of U.S. foreign policy from one which seeks, in the words of neoconservative scholar Max Boot, to, quote, impose the rule of law, property rights, and other guarantees at gunpoint if need be, to a policy of prudence, to one which accepts limits and denies both the practicality and efficacy of the self-appointed mission to make the world anew in our image. And on that happy note, I'll conclude. Thank you.
All right, so with the panel's permission and all of your forbearance, what I suggest is that we take the 15 minutes or so we have before 5, collect some questions with, I understand that there's a roving microphone. If there is one and someone has it, can you raise your hand? Okay. Yes, I see someone with a, okay, great. So why don't we collect a few questions, and then we'll give everyone on the panel a chance to make a final comment addressing any questions that they choose. So the gentleman in the back there first, and the guy with the microphone's right next to him. Very convenient.
Rick Leeds, 53% government cost crisis. What do you guys think of a monthly forum or discussion with, Russian citizens, U.S. citizens? I think the last time I saw that was about 20 years ago on U.S. TV.
Okay.
That's, I mean, I can make some other points, but that's the basic.
Right there. Right there, gentleman in the white jacket.
Neboj Shamalic, Rice Institute for Serbian Studies. We've heard a lot of suggestions on what the U.S. policy changes might be towards Russia, but we haven't really heard what sort of, does anybody on the panel think that there's actual readiness within the U.S. establishment to make any changes to the American policy, whether to Russia or elsewhere in the world?
Mm-hmm. Appropriate question given the building that we're standing in. Right here, sir.
Microphone. I'm Webster Tarpley from the Washington Grove Institute. Having heard Professor Cohen talk about tactical nuclear weapons, I'm wondering what this might look like in the financial an economic sphere, specifically economic globalization, already mentioned, and Sergei Glaziev also mentioned earlier today. The Glaziev proposals saying essentially that if the U.S. continues to go down the road of sanctions, and the Europeans also, then that might require the default on U.S. bonds. It might lead to de-dollarization. There's a form of capital controls and exchange controls, and this other question of where do you get $3 billion for a hydroelectric plant? Well, of course, the Central Bank of Russia could become a national bank and begin to contribute those kinds of credits. So if there's a fight between Siloviki on the one hand and neoliberals on the other, how will that play out? And if the U.S. continues, would it mean a new role for the BRICS Bank? Would it mean the collapse of the London market? If London collapses, can New York be far behind? And where does this all lead, both in the negative and the positive? Because it would lead to reforms that some countries have been wanting for quite a while.
Right. Economic mutually assured destruction. All right, why don't we take one more? Yes, right there. Yeah. Yep.
I have a very simple question. As I watch on Russian TV, all the destruction that is happening in Ukraine of hospitals, of schools, of residential buildings, who is going to rebuild those things? People have no place to live, no place to pursue functions of life, such as sending children to kindergartens.
Yes, I think Poroshenko will make them out of chocolate. And then just one last question there. We don't have our sense of humor.
Thank you very much, Martin Seif with The Globalist. We've had very impressive presentations from the principled right, from the American Conservative, from the principled left, from The Nation, and from Ambassador Matlock from the the principled, highly competent, traditional foreign policy establishment. And my question is, how come all these voices from across the spectrum have been marginalized? How did this happen?
Okay, excellent. Why don't we start in that case with the highly principled, highly qualified Ambassador Matlock. And I think we can just stay at our...
I can't tell you why we are marginalized in American politics. Those of you who live...
Is that on? There you go.
Are we on here? Well, those of you who live here in Washington probably have a better view of that. But, you know, I do think what lies behind it is several things. One is a total misrepresentation of how we ended the Cold War. The triumphalism that went on, and as if, number one, we ended the Cold War as a triumph comparable to military triumph is absolutely wrong. We negotiated it into the Cold War in the interests of all sides. There were no defeats. Everybody won. Yes, we ended it peacefully, and we ended it in the interest of all the other countries. Another misperception is that the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union broke up, and that was a victory of the West. You find this attitude in Russia. That gets it exactly backwards. It was Russia. The most important element in breaking up the Soviet Union was the elected leader of Russia. And why did he do it? To get rid of his rival Gorbachev. You get into personal relations. And I think one of the things that one ignores when there's too much ideology, too much, I would say, theory in the application of American policy. And as in most countries, our foreign policy is dominated by domestic politics. It's not a matter of deciding rationally where our national interest is. It's how you either promote a candidate or more often, oppose another, to cut them down. And so we have our ideologists pushing a given theme. The neocons, push the idea, you know, if we won the Cold War by military action and we caused the collapse of communism, you know, the British journal, The Economist, had on its cover when Ronald Reagan died, the man who defeated communism. It just isn't true. Reagan's policies helped us negotiate an end to the Cold War. His rhetoric assured American support for that. Our problems then were with the Republican right. The Democrats were with us on those issues. But when you decide that, well, you can do anything with American power, we're going to remake the world, instead of in the 90s building a world structure based upon cooperation, American intellectual leadership for cooperation, instead you are going to, in effect, create little Americas everywhere, using American force when necessary. This is a misrepresentation of how we ended the Cold War, and it plays out on both sides. With Russia's, in effect, you know, blaming the West and the United States for breaking up the Soviet Union when they should blame their own leaders. And, you know, many of our people now thinking that anything the U.S. proposes, if it's opposed, no matter how rationally, somehow that's anti-American. Now, you know, and, well, I think that basically most of the ideologists are wrong. It's not that everything is wrong in the ideology. We all have to think in general terms. But international relations are carried out by human beings. And human psychology is a very important part of that. And that is very often missed. And it seems that, and I think in the case of the United States, we, as almost always we have been, except in exceptional times, our foreign policy being driven by domestic politics. Right now, it is very divided, and it seems the Republicans want to find anything they can to criticize President Obama with. Even when he borrows their ideas, he's wrong. Well, you know, that's too bad, because in my day, when Reagan was doing things the Democrats thought were good for the country, they supported him. And we didn't have that sort of thing. We had two parties that knew how to govern, even though they came from different ways. And if there was a difference, Reagan would sit down with Tip O'Neill, and they'd work it out. And if Reagan could get 75 or 80% what he wanted, that was good. It wasn't that you've got to have 100% or we don't do anything. Our politics were quite different then. And, you know, another aspect of the U.S.-Russian relationship is the United States is considerably, I would almost say infinitely more important for Russian psychology than Russia is for Americans. Most Americans, you know, they're neither anti-Russian nor particularly pro-Russian. When they hear things, you know, that sound as if the Russians are acting sort of brutally toward others, they may say, well, Russia, there goes again. But Russia does not loom low, very high on the horizon of any Americans except those who come from Eastern Europe. And, you know, for Poles, for Ukrainians, almost all of our Ukrainians come from the Western Ukraine, the Galicia and those areas. It looms very large. But for most Americans, no. Whereas, you know, almost the only country Russian young people seem to be deeply interested in is the United States. So you get an overreaction in Russia. Any criticism, no matter how irresponsible that some journalist will put up, it's played as if that's the American review. Why is America doing this? Why is America doing that? So I think we do have a genuine disconnect in how each society sees the other. And that's why it's so important now to continue to expand our cultural, our human exchanges, the sort that were talked about earlier this morning. I hope there's not going to be a cutback there. I don't think there is going to be that much, and that's one of the things that distinguishes the current crisis very much from that of the Cold War. As Wayne Mary pointed out, we are not going back to the sort of Cold War in the Soviet Union at a time when there was almost no contact between our people. Not only are there nearly 50,000 Russians or Russian-speaking people in Minnesota, you'll find all over in our educational institutions and so on. The interchanges go on, these are expanding, but the attitudes, unfortunately, particularly on the Russian side, are very disturbing.
First, I would hope that President Putin gets his economic advice from Alexei Kudrin and not from Sergei Glaziev, because almost everything Glaziev proposes is in the nature of Russia shooting itself in the foot. Russia's ability to influence the international financial system to the detriment of the United States is not only rather fanciful, it certainly will win Moscow no friends in Beijing. Because there's no country in the world that is more committed to what we call globalization than is the People's Republic of China. In terms of the destruction that's taking place in Ukraine today, I'm afraid if you look at similar destruction in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Pakistan, other places, one would have to come to the conclusion that the collateral damage is likely to be ignored by governments. In the case of Ukraine, since they are developing a new relationship with the European Union, one might ask whether the rich Europeans would be willing to contribute something in terms of rebuilding and restoration. And I think actually one shouldn't be too cynical about that. I think there's a good chance for that. In terms of dialogues between our countries, whether governmental or at the civil level, I mean, there's never been a time in our respective histories when there's been so much human interaction. The number of Americans who've lived and worked, often married in Russia, the number of Russians who've lived, worked, married in this country is at a level that dwarfs anything that has ever existed before. And yet, before the Ukraine crisis developed, the atmosphere between the two governments was simply toxic. It had reached a level of interpersonal venom between the two presidents and between the two capitals of a kind that I do not myself recall even during the last decade of the Cold War. And the extent to which the two governments couldn't even agree on an agenda, couldn't even agree on how to proceed, in which we have not once but twice canceled a planned presidential summit meeting, something that didn't happen ever during the Cold War, is something of a puzzle to me, as is the fact that here in Washington, not only do you have the persistence of what I would have to characterize as Russophobia, but the extent to which Russophobia is infecting a new generation of people in Washington who hadn't even born when the Soviet Union came to an end, which I find infinitely depressing. I can't explain it, but I really do think a large part of the question comes to the responsibility of political leaders on both sides to behave like statesmen in relations between two countries which matter to each other and matters to the rest of the world.
It's more convenient for me from here to see everybody. The gentleman in the first row mentioned Sergei Glaziev, who is advisor to Russian President Economical Affairs. I don't know is he crazy or not. I think he's crazy, but I'm not sure. There is no diagnosis. But I must say that he's more crucial for Russian economy than all your sanctions together. Because when the advisor to the president publicly say such strange thing, it's terrible for the country. His last brilliant idea is to bomb Ukrainian army to help these volunteers in the southeast. Well, We have such guy as advisor to the president. We are proud. About the conflict between so-called Siloviki, guys from KGB, from military and so on, from one hand, and so-called liberals, economists, financial specialists, and so on, who are liberals, real liberals, around the president. Of course, there is a conflict. Of course, we have very smart people in the second team. I don't know about the first one, but in the second team, we really have very, very smart people, and they understand what should be done. They really understand what should be done. But, you know, the problem is that nobody has influence to President Putin. Nobody at all. He makes all the decisions himself. And all the good decisions he makes himself, as, for example, to join America after 9/11, or he made it himself. His intelligence, his Minister of Defense, and so on, they were informed about his conversation with President Bush after it happened. And the ideas with crime, the ideas like Crimea, he made himself also. Look, when he flew with the birds, you remember this, this case, yeah? What does it mean? It means that nobody could come to him and say, Mr. President, you want to fly? Okay, go ahead, but do not show it on TV. Everybody will laugh at you. So nobody influenced him. So forget about these conflicts. I do not know who will rebuild southeast of Ukraine after this war, but I am absolutely sure that the sooner President Poroshenko achieves military victory, the better. The sooner, the better. I wish him success, because if not, it's a tragedy. It's the endless tragedy. It should be stopped. It should be stopped, and it should be stopped by Ukrainian army. There is no other way. Unfortunately, it's a tragedy, but it's reality. And the last remark. You know, one of our officials said before your last general elections, he explained how our system better than your system. He said that we Russians, we have a program of economic development until 2020. And Americans, they even do not know the name of their next president. So, of course, it's our advantage. Of course, we're much better than you. So we know the name of our next president for many years now. And his name is Putin. And don't worry about elections. He will win all elections. But he's a human being. Let's think about Russia. Let's change the time scale. If we are in time scale of several months, the problem is to prevent our invasion in southeast, and so on and so on. If we are in the problem of 10 or 15 years, we must think about Russia and relationships with Russia after Putin. I wish him long years, okay, but anyway, he's a human being. So it means that I have one thing to ask you about. Don't stop, don't interrupt the exchange programs in education, culture, and science, because these programs work for future, and it's very important. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. Someone asked about the kind of foreign policy consensus earlier and the reason that might be behind that. I guess I can think of maybe two reasons real quickly. The first, at least on the neoconservative side, would be simple human vanity. George Kennan wrote in his diary, the diaries that were released, earlier this year, that the neocons need an enemy boundlessly evil so that they feel boundlessly good. The second thing that sort of underlies this consensus is there's widespread sort of acceptance or belief in democratic peace theory, and it's prevalent in the halls of Congress. I mean, I saw an interview with Senator Robert Menendez not too long ago on television. Someone said, well, what are the U.S. national interests in Ukraine? And he said, well, it's always in the U.S. interests for for governments around the world to become democracies like ours, because democracies don't fight each other. Well, anyone with a cursory sense of history knows that that isn't true. But that is something that idea of democratic peace theory has taken root in the academy and in the halls of Congress and in the executive branch. And I think it's profoundly damaging. A professor of mine, David Kaleo, has written that it's a line of reasoning that grows more dangerous when it is sincerely believed. As for the people-to-people connection, I would just note that I think that the infrastructure for more of that is there. There was an MOU signed at APEC in September 2012 on subnational cooperation. And that agreement basically allows both countries at the state and municipal levels to say, you know, we're going to cooperate even though maybe the central governments are at loggerheads over Ukraine, South Ossetia, you know, the list goes on and on. But I think that that's an agreement that's important for people-to-people contacts, and I think that it's been seriously underutilized. So that's that.
Well, thank you very much, James. Thank you, everyone, in particular to Ed and our other hosts and organizers today. And won't you all join me, please, in thanking the panel?
Okay, yeah, hold on, couple of announcements. Again, thank you so much. Just before announcement, one small observation. I think in Russia they complained that billions of dollars were invested in promotion of democracy in Ukraine, Russia. I think they should be thankful because if there were trillions, then we will get Iraq. So maybe it's good that it's only $5 billion. Okay, now on this, a couple of announcements. First of all, tonight, those who registered for reception, please, 2650 Wisconsin. I want to say that if you're not registered, please don't even try. Security is tight, and I'm sure when you'll go there, you'll be probably met with Ukrainian flags protesting your entrance, like it happened a couple of days ago. But anyway, just tonight we have reception. Then tomorrow, it's very interesting things. There are few prominent, as you know, today we were dominated by American speakers. One dissident is here, and he violated our agreement. I told him, you talk only about Obama, don't talk about Putin. And he kept talking about Putin, so I probably will write an article about...
To
Obama. Okay, well, dissidents always violate. The old dissidents here. Now, tomorrow we'll have Russians. Since some of them are on the sanctions list, then they couldn't... they couldn't come. But, you know, we live in the world of technology. And they will come, you know, via internet, all kinds of sophisticated programs. So please don't come, all of you, because Rome is not as big as this one. It's National Press Club, addresses in the program. If you really want to ask questions from another ambassador, by the way, we have 3 ambassadors today. Ambassador Kislyak, Ambassador Matlock, and tomorrow we'll have Ambassador Lukin streaming from Moscow. And also former Prime Minister of Russian Federation and former Speaker of the Upper House, really prominent folks. You'll be able to ask them questions. So frankly, I'm not encouraging all of you to show up, but so those who are really interested, who want to ask questions, it's National Press Club, address in the program, you know where it is, and the 13th floor from 10 to 12, we'll have discussion with Moscow Live. Okay, and finally, but I'm really delighted that we all talk about exchanges and you know, cooperation, cultural, etc. And then maybe you'll make an effort. Next forum like that, we were invited by Moscow, because Moscow really complaining, why you're doing all this only in Washington? Well, let's do it in Moscow. So September 7th, 8th, we'll have a similar, maybe not the same, exactly the same faces. Maybe some of you actually will find time. And of course, now you are on our mailing list, so you will not escape. So you will get announcement September 7th, 8th, 9. You will, you know, we'll have tried to revive something what Steve Cohen was talking about, East-West Accord. I have to admit, then in the old days, I was not really happy with East-West Accord. I thought it's kind of a left stuff, and I consider myself more kind of toward right. And you know, Ambassador knows, we met with him many times when he was in the White House. We talked about how to defeat communism. So we had a lot of conversation like that. But now it's very good that left and right and middle in this room, and not only in this room, we really think the same way. That the situation is pretty dangerous. We have to do something. Government, they don't know what they're doing, so maybe public and public diplomacy is now even more important. So think about September 7 to 9 in Moscow. Well, at this point, I think we should stop, and those who go to the embassy for reception, we'll see you over there. Thank you.
No, I'll bring mine.